Darla will say something. Yes. So what my role here today is to remind us that we're doing this seminar presentation in the name and honor of Arthur H. Robinson, who received his PhD from this department 7 years ago. So we like to look back, we like to remember the forebears and how we got here. In addition to earning a PhD here, he received an honorary doctorate in 1984. I was here during that time. And he's famous, of course, for having created the Robinson projection and became effectively the dean of American cartography. He adopted, his projection was adopted extensively by the National Geographic Society. And Robbie had a distinguished career also teaching and research at the University of Wisconsin. And I think is a towering figure in 20th century cartography. And he remained actually an active scholar until 2004. We're very proud of our association with Arthur Robinson. One of our emeritus professors, Joel Robinson, wrote a very nice obituary and retrospective of Robbie's career that appeared in the Annals, and so you can get reprints to those if you're interested. But in addition to naming this colloquium for him, he also donated funds to this department in view of his association with us, and that's used to support undergraduates and graduates to this day. And that's a fund that we draw on occasion. Let me mention that having a nice colloquium and inviting a guest from out of town and putting on a reception takes some resources. So we have the John E. Nelson Fund to thank for that. And Mr. Nelson anticipated that we would be able to have colloquia such as the Robinson or the Tate colloquium throughout the years, and that indeed has happened. And we've, over the years, had many, many distinguished guests come to the department. And so before proceeding, let me thank once again the Visiting Speakers Program, Ola in the past and now Joel, for putting together this event, and also to thank Darla for local hospitality and for helping arrange this visit. So we will have another thing to say here in a second, but first of all, let me welcome Karen Seto and welcome her with some tokens of appreciation. You can actually choose from amongst these, but you may want them all. I don't know. There is, well, there's various things. There's a mug, a water bottle, a pen, t-shirt, and a plaque. And also, perhaps most important, a stamped envelope to send us back receipts. So we always think practical.
Yeah.
Yeah, swag. If you have a weight limit on your carry-on baggage, you can ditch any of this. This is for you. Well, let me also mention that that you probably would like to know, hopefully, that you're joining a very distinguished group of people here in coming to give this talk. We've had Reg Gollage, Mike Goodchild, Keith Clark, Robbie himself, Stuart Fotheringham, Mike Batting, Harvey Miller, Matt Zook, and several others. And so your name will be added to the notice board outside. We have a plaque there to commemorate this, and we really are delighted that you've come to give this talk today. And now Darla will say some words as well. Thank you.
All right. So I just introduced Karen a week and a day ago at the AAG when she won the Research Excellence Award by the Human Dimensions of Global Change Specialty Group. So I had a little speech then. I'll give you maybe a slightly shorter version today, but it's my great pleasure to welcome here. I also want to say thanks to Elizabeth Root, who helped with arranging her visit and hosting. So Karen, I'll summarize some of her major accomplishments for you. She was awarded a PhD from Boston University, went to Stanford as a postdoc, basically senior research scholar, and then later assistant professor. She came to Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies in 2008 as an associate professor, promoted to full professor in 2013, and since 2014 has been the Associate Dean of Research and the Director of Doctoral Programs. Karen is a pioneer in the remote sensing of urbanization and urban land change. So she developed some techniques to deal with this learning problem very early on. She also has a strong background in economics, international economics, econometrics. So connecting the dots between flows of foreign direct investment and urban change from expatriates in Canada to the Pearl River Delta in China. She has authored 62 research articles and 4 books, and 3 out of the 4 she was first author. In 1 year, she was simultaneously awarded the NSF Career Grant and the NASA New Investigator Grant. And you know, those are really hard to come by. Very prestigious, and multiple grants from NASA's sense. In the international arena, she is, I think, I forget. She's one of the leaders of the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their working group on human settlements and infrastructure, which I think is code for urban, right, urbanization. The International Geosphere Biosphere Program, and then until last year she led, so it was 13 years or something, she led the Urbanization and Global Environmental Change program under International Human Dimensions Program and later Future Earth. So that is an international scientific network. At the national level, she's currently on the National Research Council Pathways to Urban Sustainability and has been a part of virtually every NRC group having to do with geography. So has been a really, really great ambassador for geography and getting geographic knowledge injecting into these major policy programs. I want to say, so Karen and I met back in the year 2000, when we were finishing up graduate school, and we've kept in contact since then, and it's been a really delight to work with her on occasion and to see her often and whatnot. So what I want to say impresses me the most about Karen, see now I'm back into my award speech, but the thing that I love the most about Karen is that she really exemplifies scholarly work and research as a social collaborative process. So she gathers people together and asks, hey, what can we do? How can we marshal our collective respective knowledge and address some of the key problems of the 21st century? So in that sort of leading by working with and working together has accomplished a great deal for all of us. So it's a great pleasure to welcome. So without further ado, I'll let her come on up here.
Thanks, Darla, for yet another terrific introduction. And I want to thank the department here for really this great honor to be invited to come give the Robinson Colloquium. And I will say I flew here yesterday from a NASA science team meeting where I met with Dan Brown and Mark Friedel. And they said, oh, it's a great place to be. You'll be kept very busy. And sure enough, I've had a very busy but really, really terrific visit. And I will say that one of the highlights has been the birds, visiting the bird center, and really meeting with the graduate students. So that's been really terrific. So what I thought I would do today is talk. It's not a very technical talk, and I said to Darla, I could give a very, very technical talk, or I could talk a little bit more about some big picture stuff that I've been working on that has a lot of technical stuff in the background, and I'm happy to talk about that offline or in the Q&A. But the central question that I've been interested in, really when I think about my entire career, has been about how does urbanization transform the planet? And what does urbanization mean for the planet? And more recently, I've become very interested in what the planet, how the planet responds, what that will mean for future urbanization and henceforth society. Is urbanization sustainable in its current form? And how will global patterns of whether it's climate change or changes in our food system, how will that actually affect urbanization? So what I'll do today is focus on two studies that were published in the last 6 months, looking at some of these big global trends, what they mean for planetary health in two very different ways. One is about energy use, what urbanization might mean for energy use, especially around buildings, and then what it means for global croplands. I'm going to start with this slide, and I'm curious to know how many people in this room have seen some derivation of this. Almost everybody, but not everybody. Okay, so we are now 2000, somewhere around here. We're at like 52% of the planet lives in urban areas. The UN estimates only go out to 2050, and they estimate that about 66% of the planet will live in urban areas. Here I just want to say it's really important that we get the language right, that we're actually talking about urban areas and not cities, because if you look at the UN statistics, there's actually more than 50 different definitions for what urban means. So if we go to Denmark, we're talking about a town of about 10,000 people. If you go to India, we're talking about communities where at least 75% of the male population is engaged in non-agricultural activities. So all of us women in the room, it doesn't matter what we're engaged in, but if at least 75% of the men are not working in agriculture, that's a city. Depending on whose demographic projections you believe, we're looking at a world of about 80% urban by 2100, in a world of about 10 billion people. So we're looking at a world of about 8 billion people. So again, my central question has been, what is this going to mean for the planet? I took that data and I wanted to know, what does this mean in terms of building cities on a daily or a weekly basis? So this is really simple arithmetic. We see that roughly we're adding about 1.3 million people into urban areas every single week. And so for some parts of the world, this means building new buildings and infrastructure. In a lot of the world, it means enveloping towns. Towns become cities. Some cities become mega regions. But this has been something that's, I don't want to say I stay up at night, that might be over-exaggeration, but I think about this all the time, and I think, what does this mean? Every single week, we're going to build stuff, and how we build that stuff, what does that mean for the planet? So this is a picture of Shanghai in the early 80s. I'm originally from Hong Kong and immigrated to the US when I was about 5.5. And for the first 5 years of living in the US, we would go back to visit our family in southern China pretty regularly. And I remember seeing, so this is Shanghai, but I remember seeing that much of southern China looked like this. And then in the 90s, I went to do a PhD, and this is Shanghai in the mid-2000s, and the places that I was studying started to look like this. And that really got me thinking about, well, what does this mean? How is this possibly sustainable? So Darla mentioned my involvement with the IPCC, and I was telling Ellen the story earlier that this is one of the things where if you stick your hand out and you say you're not doing it right, be careful what you dispute or what you complain about. So I've been saying to the IPCC leadership for years that they had been really focused on transport and buildings and energy, but they were ignoring the confluence of all of these sectors in human settlements, and that a big megatrend in the 21st century was urbanization. So why doesn't the IPCC deal with how urbanization could mitigate climate change? So suddenly I was asked to lead this chapter, which I then learned that there's a whole politics behind what you name the chapter. And Darla's absolutely right that this chapter is code for urban, but for a lot of different reasons, different countries didn't want to call it urban, so now it's called this very long name. But essentially, the genesis of this was to understand how can cities possibly mitigate climate change. And one of the big conclusions we came to from this assessment was that cities could do a lot. So if the top 50 emitting cities were a single country, it would be third ranked in the world. So the scale of this is enormous, and the potential is really, really big. And yet we have very little understanding of what the drivers of these emissions are, because we don't have the inter-city geographic perspective. We did, in the IPCC report, another chapter on buildings indicated that the building sector alone is a huge component of emissions. And so I started putting some of this together. The fact that we're adding 1.3 million people every single week into urban areas, the fact that the building sector is really big, and the fact that we keep having to build cities. And so I said to a number of my collaborators, I said, how will future urbanization affect land use? And what will this mean for building energy use? And what will this mean for croplands? We know that from a lot of individual case studies that cities develop in very productive areas. But I wanted to know globally, what did this mean? Again, very much from an emissions perspective originally. So this was work originally that was published, I think it was in 2012. with a postdoc, Barak Junarel and Lucy Coutura out of Boston University, we developed a model which now seems really, really simplistic. It's one of these things where, like, in hindsight, if I could do this all over, it'd be much better. But we developed a model where we projected future urban expansion. Super, super simple model. So here's what this model looks like. We took the UN World Urbanization projections out to 2008. The NRC had this report on demographic change, and it had probability distributions for different parts of the world. So we took some of that data, and so we developed some probabilistic regional population estimates for different regions around the world. We took the IPCC ESRES. This is the special report on emission scenarios. So these different scenarios that basically are storylines of what the world might look like. And so these ESRES scenarios are things like, you know, if we're in a world that's more environmental versus more economically driven. We took these ESRES scenarios and we developed these regionally specific probabilistic estimates of GDP growth going out to 2030. And we only went out to 2030 because that was the time horizon that we felt most confident about the UN population estimates. So we combined these, we ran a bunch of Monte Carlo simulations, and we come up with some projected estimates of GDP per capita. And we got some data then on urban land use, and then we basically developed relationships about how much land is used around the world based on GDP. So what's the relationship between urban land use and GDP? So, and I want to say that this was actually, this flow, the model that we ended up with, was actually, I think, might have been like the 5th or 6th derivation. We had started off with much, much more complex models. We had, anyway, I won't go into all the details, but we came up with this primarily because we had the, when we did the sensitivity analysis, we had the most, these gave us the best results. So we came up with these estimates of land, but it's not spatialized. So this is how simplistic this model is. So we have these stocks of land, but now we have to spatialize it. And so we took Gil Pontius's model, the geomode, and we modified it, and we basically took these stocks and then we distributed it around the world. And I want to say one thing that was interesting is in an earlier version of this, when we were developing all the different models and seeing which one we would use, we developed a very complex model that was an econometric, spatially explicit model, but much more computationally intensive. And the results were somewhat similar, but again, when we did the sensitivity analysis, this one had better results. We said this one ultimately still is good enough. So we ran this model, and so for every single pixel, we came up with a probabilistic forecast of the likelihood that it would become urban in 2030. And so all the data, all the code is on my website. You can download it and tear it apart and use the data. So we've got the final map, but we've got all the different Monte Carlo estimates. So this was our starting point, and one of the things that was interesting when we saw these results was that there are really big variations in the probability that land will become urban. Now, I should also say this is, again, a really simple model. So we didn't estimate, we didn't forecast future land development. We didn't assume there'd be any new roads. It's a really, really conservative model. But the point is that we saw that there was a huge amount of variation in the likelihood that land would become urban all around the world. And we thought that this was pretty interesting in terms of thinking about what policy could do to shape urban development in different areas. So one of the key results from that analysis was that roughly 20,000 American football fields would become urban every day over the next 30 years. And we compared the result from that model with other published studies. At that time, there were only 2 other published studies. One was a meta-analysis that we had done using, looking at all the English language peer-reviewed remote sensing studies. Again, this is also available on our website. So one thing that's interesting is the estimates, if we look at so these are based on locally specific remote sensing studies. Those projections are very similar to what we got with our model. Solly Angel, who's now at NYU, he had developed a very different bottom-up model. He's a planner, developed a very different model, and you see we have very different estimates there. But the point was that we could see that over the next 20 years, there'd be a huge amount of land that would become urban. So that led me to the next question, which was, what is this going to mean for the demand for buildings and ultimately for energy? What is this going to mean for the climate? So we took those probabilistic forecasts that we just saw, and I teamed up with two very different teams of building modelers. One team led by Diana Erg-Vorsans here. She was the coordinating lead author on the IPCC building chapter, so she's one of the world's foremost building energy expert. And another team, Yu Zhou, who's now at Iowa, who had worked a lot with folks at PNNL developing bottom-up, or actually top-down models of buildings. So I basically approached them and I said, would you be willing to team up and work together on this? And I didn't realize how hard it was to reconcile top-down models with bottom-up models. Whoa, so this took us about a year and a half of figuring out what these models actually did, like looking under the hood and saying, how could we do inter-model comparison? So this is the model that's based out of the Pacific Northwest lab. So it's basically this top-down model. It's basically an integrated assessment model. And this model is intended to look at this point right here. The model was designed to look at how technology improvements could actually affect energy demand. I mean, it's not a building model per se, but there are a couple of places in the model where we could inject the effect of building development in urban form. So in that model, there's a place to look at building floor area, and building floor area determines building energy use. And so we developed two scenarios for that model. One scenario where there was no policy in place, it would be business as usual in terms of the energy sector and the building sector. And then another a scenario where there would be really advanced energy efficiency technology. So that's the top-down model. The bottom-up model, totally different. So Diana's group, she's based out of Hungary, they had been developing over the last 10 years a model for 17 climate zones and lots of different building types. So she's literally modeling the demand for more than a dozen of different buildings. So I have a 10-year-old son, and at that time he was 8.5, and I said, my life was all about Legos. And I said to Diana, I said, could we take a Lego approach and tweak your model to assume that different parts of the world would want different combinations of buildings, thinking of these Legos. And so we started to do that, but the challenge was we couldn't compare that output with the top-down model. So we have a totally different output that does take this Lego approach, but it's not included in this paper. In this paper, what we did was we looked at building type, we looked at building vintage. This is really important. How old the building is determines the energy efficiency for heating and cooling, but also the material. But also, one thing that was really important was it really determines the rate at which these buildings could be renovated and redeveloped. And so for this model, we developed 3 different scenarios. One was where there's no change in the efficiency of buildings. Buildings would stay the same in their efficiency. One where there was moderate efficiency with current policies in different parts of the world, current building codes. And then what Deanna likes to call deep efficiency. So she says, what if we were to deploy what's technically feasible but not economically feasible? So she says this technology is already in place, but it's not widely adopted because it's really expensive. But let's just take deep state of the art. So I learned a lot in this project because I learned a lot about buildings, and I learned that roughly we can, are there any building experts in this room? There are no building folks. I can say whatever I want now. So I learned that roughly we can categorize all the housing in the world into 4 major types, just housing. So we have single-family detached homes. And now I look at these and I envision like all the energies going through all the walls and all the roof. We've got single-family attached row houses, very popular in Europe, more energy efficient. Walls are heating each other, but we're still losing heat through the ceilings, roof, but you can't avoid that in any case. But there's much more energy efficient, but generally older vintage, and not as popular today. We've got multi-family walk-ups. So compared to these are single family on the here, this dimension, and the vertical, but these are single family maybe across the horizontal or maybe just a little section here. So these are generally smaller area per household, per capita, and generally more efficient per capita as well. And then you've got multi-family high-rises. So, and for a long time I used to think these must be really efficient because you've got all these people. But then looking at the data, I realized it takes a lot of energy to maintain those elevators, which I hadn't really thought was a big energy sink, but apparently it is. So those are, imagine those are like some of the 4 major building types around the world. So we have our top-down model and our bottom-up model. So this is the Lego approach, bottom-up, and then the top-down. And what we wanted to do was to ask ourselves, what would the effect of urban form be on energy use? Because one of the main results of the IPCC chapter on urban mitigation was that urban form matters, especially around transport and accessibility. That's really important in the mixture of land use. But because these models didn't have a parameter for form, we had to think of some proxy that we could convert the data that we had into the models. So we basically just looked at population density or building density as a proxy for density. So here's some of the key results here. So here we have population density in this section, and then these graphs here show floor area. So one of the first take-home messages from this is, for many parts of the world, North America, Europe, Western Europe here, there's not going to be a lot of variation in population density. If you take all the demographic forecasts, there's just not that much variation in the density across these places. But in places where you see a lot of variation in population density, potentially going into the future, are in China. This is Central Asia and China, and also in South Asia. And when we convert the population density into floor area, this is where the variation of population density becomes really important, because for most of the world, you see that there's not a lot of variation across all the scenarios in terms of the demand for floor area. But where you see a huge difference on the order of about 20 billion square meters is in China. So that's where we have a lot of wiggle room in terms of shaping the density of population and then ultimately the demand for floor area. So this was, for me, one of a really, really surprising result, that we could see that urban density influences future energy use as much as energy efficiency. And I'm not going into the details of the model comparison and all of that, but for us, again, I was really surprised because so much of the literature is focused on energy efficiency and there's not that much on the geography of urban form. And again, this is super simplistic, it's just density, but it made us think, like, what if we actually did look at urban form from a finer grain, what could we actually see? Like this result, that there's a big difference between the high and low urban density scenarios on the order of 8 to 9 exajoules per year. This is huge. And so, we started talking a lot about what are some of the low-hanging fruits for achieving some of these mitigation wedges. And it's interesting, I've never been to Columbus, and Darla drove me around a little bit yesterday, and I saw a little bit with Ellen today, and just to see even in Columbus, which I had envisioned as being probably very horizontal, to see that there's more increasing density in Ohio, in Columbus. So this seems like perhaps a low-hanging fruit, and in many parts of, at least in the United States, there's certainly more of a trend towards urbanist living and such. What's interesting is in China, there isn't, if you look at the surveys and popular sentiment around densities, there isn't a desire to increase densities because densities are relatively high already. I'm just highlighting some of the main results from our study, and again, not going into the nitty-gritty of the model, but this was another really surprising result, and this, I think, requires a secondary study to really understand what's going on. And so we looked at how much energy could we save if we retrofitted today versus if we waited, let's say, 10 or 20 years until the state-of-the-art technology became widely available economically. Now, we had a lot of discussion. Keep in mind, we developed this paper about a year plus ago, and we said, well, there could be some policies or subsidies or policies to really encourage more energy efficient technologies to be embraced and developed. But it seems like in many places that's actually not going to happen. We're not going to deploy these types of policies. So what we found was that if we retrofit a little bit later, and we're not talking about 100 years from now, but if we actually retrofitted a little bit later until the state-of-the-art technology were more economically widely available, we'd actually have a bigger impact on energy use and emissions. And the way that it's been explained to me by many of the building engineers is that right now what we tend to do, and we just did this in my own home, I said to my husband, we should have waited till the study came out before we put in all the high R-value windows in our house. But basically what we're doing right now is we're doing piecemeal building improvements. We might get better windows, but very few of us are actually doing deep retrofitting by way of insulating our walls, changing the entire building envelope. And I guess, and I've learned now, that that technology is available, it's just expensive right now. And so the building engineers think that in 5 to 10 years some of this technology will be more economically feasible, where you can do what they call whole building renovation. And so your entire house would be much more efficient, and so you would actually save a lot more energy. This was also interesting to see is that a majority of the building stock in North America and Western Europe is actually going to have to be replaced or renovated by 2050. And so the technology that is in place and economically feasible in 2050 is going to be really important for thinking about those energy scenarios going to the future. So, I think a really big question is whether buildings like these that are more energy efficient than single-family homes, but are usually older vintage, I think a really big question is what will be the policy incentives to do large-scale retrofitting of a lot of our residential building stock. If we look at building development around the world, we're seeing that a lot of the buildings that are being developed are not using the most most energy efficient, aren't really using the newest building technology, much less energy efficient technology. So there's a huge amount of gains that could be made in terms of energy efficiency. But I think the main take-home point here from this paper was that urban form and the geography of these cities really matter in terms of just the building demand. Now, a question that comes up a lot, and I'm going to anticipate this, is, well, did we look at transport? And no, we didn't look at transport. This is a simple model, but clearly there would be a lot of co-benefits if we think about the savings with transportation as well. Okay. I'm going to skip to this. A few years ago, my former colleague, Hal Mooney from Stanford, sent me this photo, and he had this email message, like, is this what the world is coming to, and how do we prevent this from happening? And I wrote back to Hal and I said, well, I have seen this in many parts of China, and I do think it's a question of how we can mitigate the negative impacts of urbanization on cropland. But I said to him, but first of all, we don't really know what the impacts are going to be globally, which then set me off to this different project, where I put together a slightly different team of folks from Germany, again, my former postdoc, and folks also from Austria, where we took the forecast that I showed earlier and we combined it with a lot of other existing data sets to look at whether urbanization would affect some of the most productive farmlands. So we took our forecast from 2012, we took Naveen Ramankutty's estimates of croplands, and then we took lots of other data from the FAO, the World Bank has data on poverty and development indicators. We also took some very detailed data on crops for specific regions, and we basically did a spatial analysis to look at what future urbanization would mean for global croplands, so that I could actually respond to Hal's email. So this is essentially what the analysis looks like, where you can see that there are a lot of places where urbanization is going to compete with cropland, especially in northern India, in northeast China, which is not surprising, in parts of coastal Nigeria. I want to just zoom in on a few of the key results from this analysis. Again, another surprising result for me. I had been wondering whether urbanization would be this big impact on global croplands, and actually it's not going to be a big impact on global croplands. If we look at the relative loss of croplands, it's about 2% of current croplands. The study does not take into account the growth of new cropland, so we know that there will be new croplands that are put under production. So it's not clear whether this is going to be offset by that. But he said, it's not 10% of the world's cropland. So that's one big result, that it's not as big a deal globally. But one thing that is a big deal is regionally, this is going to have big impact. So in Europe, it's only about 0.5% of the total croplands. In Australia, Asia, it's less than 0.5%. But in places like in Asia and Africa, the effects are really going to be significant. And if we zoom in on just a few places, Nigeria estimated almost 6% of the cropland will be lost, almost 8% in Pakistan. In Egypt, because Egypt's agricultural land is along the Nile, and that's where most of the urbanization is, they're going to see about 1/3 of the loss of cropland. It's really, really significant. If we look at the total the production loss in terms of the percentage of total crop production, that's really huge as well. So in a place like in Nigeria, we see about almost 12% loss in total crop production. And again, this is not taking into consideration any new crop growth or expansion or changes in yield. In terms of whether it's funny, this project partly started because I kept hearing from people that, well, cities began in the most productive farmland around the world, and I wanted to test this statistically. And so we haven't been able to prove it yet, but what's interesting is, at least in this case, depending on where you're looking, Some places, the land that's going to be lost to urbanization is more productive than national averages, but not in all cases. So in Australasia here, the land that's likely to be lost to urbanization is less productive than national averages. So it really varies by region. When we looked at 4 specific crops, when we looked at corn, maize, rice, and soybean, we saw that there's going to be really different losses in different parts of the world. And I just want to highlight here that in Africa, we're estimating about a 19% loss in total rice production and maybe about 26% total loss in wheat production. So in terms of thinking about livelihoods and the economic impact in certain regions, this is going to be really acute. And one of the things I'm really interested in looking at is, could we actually start monitoring some of these high-risk, high-vulnerable places to see whether these crops are actually being lost to urbanization and what these crops actually are. So what we're seeing in the late 20th century, early 21st century is that cities and urban regions have reached this unprecedented size. Jamaica is about 11,000 square kilometers. Greater Tokyo is about 13,000 square kilometers. And so I think it raises a number of interesting questions about governance and the institutions that could effectively manage this very large area to mitigate cropland loss or to effectively shape urban form. And I'm not enough of a policy person to understand, or an urban planner to understand what some of the solutions are, but it's very clear that the absolute size of some of these urban areas is, I think, a policy governance challenge. If we look at places like Beijing and Shanghai, they have 21 million, 25 million people. All of Australia has 23 million. So, the scale, the land scale and the population scale, I put these numbers up here to conclude the talk, mainly because I think some of the big challenges around managing the growth of these large urban areas are going to be on the policy and institution side. Again, out of my zone of expertise, but if we're going to shape urban form to be more compact, to demand fewer buildings, and really get that low-hanging fruit for energy savings, I think a lot of this is going to be about policy. I do think there are some huge challenges, as I mentioned, with these mega urban regions, because they have multiple centers. It's not like the downtown. There is no downtown. There are multiple urban centers, and there are very different forms of governance. And again, this is, I think, a big question going forward is how do we manage these places and how do they interact and collaborate to manage in more effective ways, given that they all have their own, probably their own, not only their own constituents, but responding to very different needs as well. One last thing that we did in that paper was we looked at mega urban regions around the world. So we looked at a number of mega urban regions, very large contiguous areas, and we wanted to see what is the loss of the prime land in that area. And one thing that's interesting in looking at this, and I think I have it in the next slide, is that these mega urban regions really differ a lot in their spatial form, and that has very different impacts on the agricultural land. So some of these places are one contiguous urban fabric, and so there's the farmland that's still in place is really along the periphery. And some of these are more hopscotchy in nature, and so there's still parcels of farmland. So I've been doing a little bit of work now with the FAO and thinking about what are some of the different strategies that could be deployed on the conservation side that could work in conjunction with the urban planning side in terms of saving some of these prime farmlands. We ultimately wanted to know, how can institutions shape urban growth? Because it's clear that how we grow cities is going to be a key part of sustainability. We took some data from the World Bank, and the World Bank has these governance indicators, and they're at the national level, so it's not city specific. But one thing that's interesting is that, so you want a big number, right? So you want a high number, a number that's closer to 100. So apparently, we have very good rule of law here, and apparently, so far, we have good regulatory quality, and government is effective, and roughly we're not that corrupt. So, we're pretty good among all of these other countries. But if we look at the countries where urban growth is going to be fast and cropland is going to be threatened, we see that in a number of these places, there's either low government effectiveness or high government corruption. And so now we're actually working with conservation agencies, not just the FAO, but like the TNC, the Nature Conservancy, and thinking about how can they invest effectively to think not just on the conservation side, but also about building capacity on the governance side. So as I mentioned, I've been really interested in ultimately how urbanization is going to affect the planet. And a lot of my work is focused on this link right here between urbanization and food systems, this link between built up areas and the loss of agricultural land. But from my field work, I've become much more interested in just the loss of agricultural land, but changes in culture, demand for food, and how that actually could affect food systems more broadly, and then ultimately, again, the link between food and energy and climate. If we look at the literature on urbanization on food, there's a really simple story that's in the literature, and the story is this: as people move to cities, they get richer, and as they get richer, they eat more meat, and as they eat more meat, that requires more land, and everything's going to go down the toilet. That's basically the story. But if you actually go to urbanizing places in Africa and in Asia, you see actually urbanization is not just about richer people, but it's about people working away from home, a lot more women in the workplace, and the opportunity cost of time is huge, especially in developing country cities. And so there's this, and I put here in this diagram these ties that we don't really know. These are the dotted lines where we don't really know what these links are. But my hypothesis right now is that these links could be really big in terms of their impacts. Because in many places we're seeing that the opportunity cost of time is really large, and people are substituting convenient foods, packaged foods, foods that have a long shelf life, which all have very large embodied energy costs. And so this is my next project that'll take me a while to look at. Some main conclusions from our work is mainly that urban forms can have a big impact on croplands, on buildings. We know that future urban expansion is going to take place on these prime agricultural lands. And I think another related question is, what other ecosystems will be placed under agricultural production to meet the growing demand for food? And that will have also another embodied energy component. I'm going to end with this animation. It's my student, Meredith Reba. She's been collecting through two different sources. One is an archaeological source, and one is a historical source of the growth of cities over the last 6,000 years. And this was her master's thesis, to put it all into a database. When she first started with this project, we thought it would be just like a 1-month project. Didn't realize it was going to take literally a couple of years. She published this paper in Nature Scientific Data, and then, this is amazing, the internet. So a visualizer saw the data, and he asked if he could make an animation out of it. And we said, sure. Do we have to pay you? He said, no, it's for free. So he made this. Max Galva is a data visualizer. He takes data sets, primarily scientific data sets, and he wants to make it accessible to the public. He has overlaid Meredith's data set with key events in human history. And the entire video is available online. I'm playing it in quadruple speed. So this is going to be really fast. But for me, one of the big questions is, as the planet urbanizes, what is going to be the tipping point for changing the patterns or the rates or the magnitudes of urbanization, and what are the feedbacks between the climate system on patterns of urbanization? And with that, I'll just end and let you see the rest of the animation. Well, thank you.
I'm hesitating to ask the first question, but I'll ask it in terms of the common good, and that is, you saw many examples here of you having a question, figuring out who the teams in the world are working on it that could help you, and then bringing them together and getting them to collaborate. Do you want to comment a little bit on that? Like how you do that, and like how you get people that have their own specific models of products and whatnot to work together and collaborate.
Yeah. How do I do that? It's a lot of begging. So I think part of it is, with all of these projects, I knew them from some interactions. So I knew Tiana from my PCC, and we knew each other, we trusted each other as scholars, and I think that's really important, is to have that mutual trust. And I had this project, and she really wasn't interested in this, I'll say. And I said, how could we make this interesting for you? And I've learned a lot over the years in terms of seeing how people can bring together teams together. So I've learned from watching folks like, I would say, when I was at Stanford, people like Steve Schneider bring together teams, that part of it was listening to what they were interested in, and making sure that this project was win-win for everybody. And then the other key part is finding the resources. And I have found, it's funny you mentioned that I got the NSF Career Award, and I've never been funded by NSF since. And so I have found more success in finding small pots of money. And I'm talking about small, like, might be $2,000 or $3,000, just enough to cover one person's fare, to come together, to have a workshop, to have a conversation. And the amazing thing is also, even though with the internet and with Skype we can talk on the phone, there's nothing that replaces this. And so I find that if we can meet for a day, it makes a huge difference. It makes a really, really huge difference. I also find that it helps to be generous. And so I've been wanting to do this project, and I said to the team that I put together, I said, who on your team would want to lead this? Like, I don't want to lead it. I want to put the team together and answer an interesting question. And so the cropland paper it's a doctoral student who's the first author, and he ended up coming to Yale as a visiting scholar. And we cobbled money together to bring him here. A lot of money came from Germany. As his advisor, someone I knew, and I said, who on your team would be interested in doing this? And so I think it wasn't like, you do this, and I'm going to be the first author, and and so it was like, let's work it out. And the questions really evolved, and the building one is a good example where I knew nothing about building energy technology, and so I had to learn a lot, and the idea of what I wanted to do and what the paper was are radically different, other than it's about urbanization and buildings. Yeah. But for me, that's the most fun part of research, is collaborating with folks. Yeah. Yes, Kendra. Sorry, Harv.
Yeah, I found it interesting at the beginning how you sort of set up the main driver of urban built environments as people moving into cities. Because in the Latin American context that I'm thinking of, the vast hordes of, 1 point however many million people moving into cities, they're making shacks out of cardboard. And the people who are buying and using the cement may or may not live there. They're probably not going to live in the high rises they build in, say, Panama.
Yeah.
Because that growth is being fueled, the demand for energy and resources is being fueled by international capital or illicit capital. It's not being fueled by the people who are living on the margin, by the influx of people.
Yeah.
So I was surprised that you were leading with people as the driver of sort of built environment change rather than capital. So how do you account for that?
Yeah. So,
Because you know the numbers better than I do about informality and
yeah,
you
it's
know.
huge, right.
Yeah.
Like 900 million.
Yeah, I mean, most people are living in
Yeah.
things that have no floor,
Yeah,
right? Like it's dirt, so it wouldn't even count on it, in some of these metrics.
yeah. So I use that, I put that up here as mainly like a heuristic, and for me, just the image of needing to house these people as a driver for me to understand what forms that might take. It'd be interesting. You got me thinking. I'm going to go back and look at some international capital data because we actually have some data on remittances and global flows of capital, and it would be interesting to put this in a slightly different way. The paper on building technology, Diana is actually really interested in the energy required to upgrade slums around the world and the savings with the trade-off between what you would save on money with health, all the health issues with slums, versus the energy saving. I mean, these are apples and oranges, but that's what, going back to the team, that's what her team had been working on for a long time. So that paper actually has a little section on slums, informal settlements. It didn't get a big play in the paper because the reviewers thought it wasn't part of the bigger story. But you bring up a good point. I mean, this is, for me, it's just a heuristic for thinking about taking a different lens on the urban statistic at the global scale. Because for me, I'm thinking 66% of the world being urban doesn't mean that much to me. And if I can convert that to a different way, that makes a little bit more sense in terms of thinking about the magnitude of this.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. But I'm kind of upset that you anticipate my question about transportation.
I had to do my research before I showed up.
Because that really would have a huge effect.
We gotta talk. That could be the next project.
We should. I mean, you bring people closer together, it reduces distances, but it also can increase congestion.
No, it's huge.
But then if we can convert people from cars to public transit, walkability, bikeability. The other effect, of course, is that people get richer, societies get richer, and they tend to motorize.
Yeah.
They tend to want cars. So there's a causal chain there we have to try to break, and I think is weakening in many parts of the world, but not all.
Yeah, and one thing that's, for me, it's frustrating about the IPCC report is because it's written in sectors, and the sectors don't really talk to each other very much. The transport sector assumes that we can just go from individual cars to other types of transportation and to decarbonize cars and all of this, but it doesn't take into account that we need some kind of land use plan to enable these alternative forms of transportation.
Exactly right.
Yeah. But
I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
I do have a question about the cropland, I think. I understand the threats of the crop and cropland loss and urbanization of prime agricultural areas, but in the sense that there's a good part of that, which is you're bringing people to where things are being grown, so there's less energy required to move crops to people or move water to crops. So it's not all bad to see urbanization, especially if it's dense urbanization in prime agricultural. I was just wondering if you agree or disagree with that.
So Carl Zimmer, and I've talked a lot about the impact of urbanization on cropland and livelihoods especially. So there's a little part in that paper where we talk about the impact of livelihoods. So there's some really interesting work that's been done primarily in Africa, looking at the relationship between city size and food diversity and city size and supermarket diversity. And so the bigger the city, at least in the case of Africa, often the smaller farmers get priced out and also they don't have access to the supermarkets, and there are fewer supermarkets. And so it ends up edging out these small, I'm going to get it, small farm holders. Yeah, small scale farm holders.
We are seeing
As the
growth
cities get bigger.
And we are seeing the growth of urban agriculture, especially in the developing world. It's not just a hipster thing in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. But there's about urban agriculture. Naveen has an interesting paper, Ramakutty, on urban agriculture. So he looked at the world and said, how much food could you actually grow with urban agriculture? Yeah. Yes.
Am I next?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Karen. That was really great. And thanks for coming to Bird earlier.
was great.
And talking to us, coming from the coast to the heartland.
I've never been invited to see. So.
Oh. Pretty soon you're going to all be scrambling here. Because my question revolves around sort of the sea level response. I wonder how much your models are taking into account dynamic responses back from the biophysical to the human.
None.
Okay. And whether that's a concern or a thought about,
Yeah.
and even some of these thresholds of
Yeah.
heat response and indices, what
Yeah.
that may mean for energy infrastructure too.
Yes. So, two things with that. I don't know if any of you saw the New York Times had a big issue on the Pearl River Delta in South China and basically said, here, it's being inundated. So that's what I did my dissertation on 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, I remember meeting with the planner's office and showing them data and projections of sea level rise, and their response was, they're going to build dikes. And I wish I had recorded that conversation and posted it on the New York Times website. But we do have a study now, which is looking at the growth of cities around the world, the historical growth, and what percentage of those assets are going to be stranded due to sea level rise. What's interesting is that so much of the development that we've seen in Asia has been precisely in places that are either at risk for sea level rise, but the other huge risk is actually risk for flooding inside the city, not even places that are that coastal. I have another student who's doing a dissertation looking at the interaction between, as cities grow, what is the interaction between the urban heat island effect and global climate change? So he's calling it, don't anyone steal it yet, but he's gonna call it acute. This is terrible, I can't remember. Acute, it's called augmented something urban temperature extremes. And so he's developing a biophysical model that says this is what could happen if you look at the urban heat island combined with the climate effects. And he's really interested in looking to see what are the possibilities of vegetation and irrigation to actually mitigate some of the effects. Acute compound urban temperature extremes.
All right.
Acute.
Great. Good.
Household name soon.
Nice.
Yes.
Thanks for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I have two questions. The first question is about the model you use to predict urban expansion.
Yeah.
Because I'm more interested in this part. I can see that. Sorry. I can see that you have considered both the prediction and 3D factors. But I was wondering because in many cities the policies to protect the small in the organization and investors also about the buildings that government construct to hold this population. So, but the policy factor is more difficult to be quantified and to be put into the model. So I was wondering, have you thought about whether to consider some policy issues in the model in the future, or have you thought about whether this will influence the result?
Oh, so both of those are easy questions. So I'm sure it would affect the result because we're a very different variable, right? And it's about, it would be very local. The policies would be very local. I'm sure it would have some impact on results. How big the impact is, I'm not sure. The first question about whether I would include it. So I wouldn't include policy in any future work in this area, partly because the scope that I'm looking at is at the global scale. and we talked about this as a team, like what do we want to include in terms of policies or incentives, and it's very difficult to find something that could be applied even at the regional level. That's a bit of a cop-out, but I think that you could design a model that would be specific for your region and to include lots of policies and different variables in terms of a policy instrument. But then you'd be trying to collect this for literally the entire world at one scale. Yeah. Even doing it at the country level would be challenging. But this model is not done at the country scale. It's done at regional scales.
And another thing is about the relationship between organization and the loss of content. I can see that, yeah, I agree that to a result that organization will lead to the loss of content, but what about the relationship between the organization and the agricultural productivity? Because if we look into the history or look at different countries, maybe the higher level of organization will have some skill over the fact. So these areas, maybe the agricultural productivity will be higher. So will the organization really lead to the loss of agricultural productivity? I think this will be a very interesting topic.
I agree. I have a student who did a dissertation on that. So this is my student, Li Jiang, who's now at Renmin University of the Econ Department. So she looked specifically at what is the relationship between urbanization and investments in cropland and yield, and then also the likelihood that that land would be converted around those cities, just for China. She only looked at cities in China. So I can send you her papers. Yeah.
Thanks so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
I had a question pretty similar to Kendra's, but coming out of China. And I wanted to ask how the research could be redesigned, or how it might look different if we lose the assumption that urbanization is driven by population growth, and instead, in China, Max Woodworth in this department and then a whole bunch of other folks have sort of made compelling arguments about there not really being a causal a link between urbanization and population, but that it's being driven by other things, specifically capital accumulation. And then also thinking historically, regionally, about all of the different variation. Is urbanization, or how would you argue that urbanization is cogent enough of a phenomenon on a worldwide scale to be able to make useful conclusions at that scale, rather than rooted in specificity and more closer to the urban scale itself?
Yeah. So we're only looking at land, right? So urbanization is multidimensional, right? So it's economic change, it's populations, all these different things. And I think, historically we look at urban studies, it's been one city at a time. So it's a lot of qualitative work, looking deep into a city. We know a lot about a city. And I think, we look at the great thinkers in urban studies, they've really been looking at, let's say, Chicago or New York, just one city at a time. And we've learned a lot from those studies. I think that given the magnitude of urbanization today and its clear links to planetary health and Earth system process, that I would argue that there's a need for that kind of in-depth, one city at a time study, but that we also need to bring urban studies into a science that's hypothesis-driven, that we can test different hypotheses and use data so that it's not going to be specific for any one place. And that is a huge weakness for this model. So I imagine that it's probably not right for any one place. But the idea is to generate scenarios of what could happen under certain assumptions. So my goal here is not to say, oh, this is going to happen, but I was just surprised that we hadn't even done this kind of study before, at any scale. And I think that if we're going to think about urbanization as part of the solution, to, let's say, climate change or poverty reduction or many of the sustainable development goals, I think given the limited human and financial resources, that I would argue that moving it into more of a hypothesis-driven science would probably get us more return on our investment, and then thinking about what could work as opposed in many different places. But again, I think it has to be both, let's say, hypothesis-driven large data sets with bottom-up, in-depth analysis at one city at a time. I wanted to just show you this. This is a paper we published in 2011. It's the meta-analysis. So this is based out of, I think, 326 or 359, something like that, 300 peer-reviewed English language studies using remote sensing to look at urban growth. And so we used meta-analysis methods to look at what are the drivers. Now these are really coarse drivers, so this is not, again, city-specific. But the immediate thing to see is that in North America and in Europe, population growth is not driving land change. Urban land change is really driven by GDP growth. So it's more economic development. In Africa, we have GDP growth as not significant, not because it's actually not significant, but because so much of the economy is in the informal sector and it's not captured in the census data. But what's interesting for me is to see the difference between the relative importance of population growth versus GDP growth in China and India. So these were for data from 1988 to 2008. And we see that population growth is not as important as GDP, but in India, population growth is more important. I will say for my dissertation work in the late 90s, I looked only at the Pearl River Delta, looking from 1973 to 1988. And in that period, most of the urban growth was driven by population growth. So China's reached a different phase now where the land change is really more economic change and population. But in India, it's still, there's not, India, there's not a lot of infrastructure, not a lot of buildings. The tallest building in India is like 23 stories in Gurgaon. It's a totally different scale. It's a lot of people, but not a lot of infrastructure. Yes?
Thank you very much for the presentation. So I think this arrives to different questions as well. Like we're kind of modeling what's going to happen or what's the direction. But you mentioned a little bit about what should the different attempts to live in a more sustainable world. Are these different attempts around the world being also modeled? Like, and this is a very political issue, but for example, I think that, just to give one example, the Black Panthers, they were having their own agricultural system, to feed themselves, that actually, because of different political reasons, they were doing their own contribution to a more sustainable world, and I think it's this is happening all over the world. Like poor people's trying to survive, and according to their own methodologies and ways, they are actually succeeding in having a more sustainable world. Are these kind of different? Which would be the solution in the different contexts? Been modeled as well?
So I don't know of a model that has incorporated many different conceptual frameworks about sustainability. I think that's what you were asking, I think. But it's clear that in terms of thinking about, let's say, emissions, the biggest sources are from consumption and primarily middle to high income
countries. And so I don't know if your question is whether we're taking into consideration more locally based strategies for sustainability that's more at different scales around the world. Is that the question?
My question is if it is even being asked. This.
I think that there have been, certainly I have colleagues at Yale who've been looking at different concepts of sustainability and what a sustainable world looks like. I don't know if that necessarily needs to be modeled, but there are certainly a lot of discussions about different frameworks of what a sustainable world would look like. And these, I think, have a lot to do with different worldviews about values and values and issues around consumption and also around justice as well. I think one big question for me, and as my own thinking has evolved as I think about, what does urbanization mean for the planet? My own thinking has evolved into thinking, how do we incorporate issues of justice and equity as we think about the kind of world we want in the future? Maybe that's what we mean. I'm not sure. That's not incorporated in any of this kind of work.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I was interested in whether or not there's an interest in this field of study for examining variation within cities and comparing that, because that would perhaps get at the gross socioeconomic polarization within cities, right? So that, I kind of, one might get the sense, from these aggregated data at the scale of cities, that things in the United States are pretty good, governance is great, we've got cases like Flint, Michigan, which is just, that one's been made, that case has been made public, but there's so many others. And it just so happens that, where governance completely falls apart happens to be in poor places, and it's classed, it's racialized, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm just wondering if if an analysis of the kind that you're doing that would take into account differences within cities and then compare to something that you might interested in or other people are interested in.
So I don't know if I can pull this up fast enough. So yes, so that work is being done. There is a paper that was just published like a month ago, 2 months ago. Computer's not responding right now, but here we go. A paper that was just published in NAS by Robert Sampson, a sociologist at Harvard. And he has data for different cities in the U.S. And he's actually looking at neighborhood inequalities in the United States. And his paper shows that there are huge inequalities within cities and that these citywide, city-level data really mask these extreme inequalities. And so when we think about sustainability, the one city number only tells one story, but really need to dig in at the neighborhood scale. So Robert Sampson, that paper came out, again, just a month ago. And there's another paper that's coming out and also in PNAS. It's coming out like in the next week. It's been accepted. It's in final proofs. It's by Luis Betancourt and his group. And they're looking at neighborhood data for South Africa and Brazil, and looking at what are some of the determinants for environmental and social inequality within cities. So you're absolutely right. We need to get down to the sub-city data to understand some of the equity and sustainability issues. Both of those papers are using census-based data, but I think that if we combine it with other types of data around the built environment, clearly a lot of these things are spatially coordinated. But I would definitely look at Sampson's paper. It's really, really interesting.
And I just want to follow up. I have a comment. I'm interested in your thought about that. It seems to me that I'm thinking that sustainability is something about the environment, period, and then there's these other things that are around. Misses the interrelation of all of these things. And so if the problems are understood as environmentally driven and all about the environment, then policy is never going to do anything because problems of the environment are intersect with social, cultural, economic kinds of issues, political issues, power relations, things like that. And so I'm just curious what you think about that.
I totally agree. I mean, I completely agree, and I hope I didn't, clearly I must have given the impression that I'm only thinking about the environment. I have used the environmental lens primarily because that's what I'm trained to do, and I know that. And I bring up the Sampson's piece because his primary argument in that paper is in order to achieve environmental sustainability, you must look at the equity component, and that those two are deeply intertwined. And so if you don't engage the social, he doesn't really talk about the cultural piece, but really the socio-economic piece and the political piece, you're not going to achieve the sustainability piece. And so his argument is you start with that piece first. You need to get the data on that as well to really fully understand how they're intertwined. And Louise Bennett's course paper is the exact same argument as well. So I would definitely agree with that. And my response to this gentleman's question about how my own thinking is thinking about justice and equity, I mean, that's not my area of research, but recognizing that the environmental piece is clearly linked to this equity and development, poverty and justice component. And that's, again, out of my wheelhouse, and that's where I have to more collaborations with other people like Robert Sampson and others who are really thinking about this. One thing that's been a challenge for me in this area, though, is much of that work is very site-specific. And so I'm always thinking, well, how does this scale up? What are some of these dynamics, let's say institutions or modes of governance that lead to these particular outcomes? And do we see these patterns in different places? So anyway, it's been a conceptual challenge and a methodological challenge, but anyway, my own thinking is completely aligned with your comment.
Let's give Karen a big round of applause.